Hello Neighbor is one of the most infamous indie games in recent memory. Starting as just a pre-alpha about intruding into your neighbor's home to look for secrets, that quickly blew up into an internet phenomenon in just a few months, thanks to its promising puzzles, learning AI that grew as you played, and of course the mysterious lore they built around it that drew fans into each update while games like FNAF and Bendy and the Ink Machine were exploding for similar reasons. Only for the final game to release and end up being a major disappointment in pretty much every way. And for most people, that's where the game ended. However, after this spark of success, the developers kept working and would develop an entire franchise around this game, including a sequel, a prequel, a canceled spin-off, a mobile game, even a third Hello Neighbor game on the way right now, among many more. But over the past couple months, I played every single one of them, nearly 100 hours of gameplay and 200 hours worth of games, and today I'm ranking all of them out of 10 to find out how the old games stand up today, how good the new ones are, and which one is the best. This is every single Hello Neighbor game ranked. Here we are at the first version of Hello Neighbor, the pre-alpha. There are earlier versions around in prototyping, but this was the first one to release publicly and what put Hello Neighbor on the map originally. So our neighbor is hiding a secret in his basement, and it's our job to break into his house and unlock the many security measures on the door to find out what was inside, while he attempts to chase us cat and mouse style. With the main draw of this game that made it so popular in the first place being that anytime the neighbor caught you, he would learn from your mistakes and lock doors, place cameras, or set traps, allowing him to develop like a real person with every failure. With this being said, while the concept itself is really interesting and I totally understand what got people so hooked on the idea here, this pre-alpha still has quite a lot of growing pains. The sneak survival aspect of it works relatively well. They do a good job at making you feel like an intruder wanting to grab what you can super fast before you're noticed, and the game is often pretty scary too. But I guess as with any pre-alpha, the game is inherently super basic. All you have to do to win is grab an unguarded hammer from the furnace, grab a key or the lockpick both right next to the door, and finally use a UV light on the wall behind a picture frame to get a code and unlock the keypad into the basement that at this point literally held nothing. But despite its simplicity on the surface, the game itself is often still super frustrating because while the neighbor's mechanics are pretty impressive this early into development, he still has a ton of bugs and is often overpowered, to the point where if you're genuinely trying to beat the game, you're best off just restarting it after every death, because once you get caught more than once, the traps, cameras, and barricades become a nuisance more than anything. To fight this, they made it to where the UV lamp only spawns after completing one day in a room that you have to break a window in order to access. But again, doing this just comes off as annoying more than anything, especially since I experienced a lot of glitches when it came to the game crashing after getting caught, or the neighbor simply spotting me from a mile away, making it much more frustrating than it had to be. It's clear the devs were still learning how to make a game here. I mean, it doesn't have a start menu and isn't even in the right aspect ratio, so you have to give them credit for even making this pre-alpha considering their basic knowledge, but as a game, I still can't give it any higher than a 3 out of 10, although the potential is certainly there for future titles. Hello Neighbor Alpha 1 is the first real, fully fleshed out version of the game. This version contains a menu screen, even if it looks like this, a tutorial, various cutscenes, and a much bigger and more expansive house with actual puzzles. And all of these changes, I would say, make for a very fun game this time around. The alpha starts with a primitive but welcome cutscene of us moving in town and being watched over by the neighbor, where after moving in, we explore the neighbor's home to again find his basement locked off with a padlock and a couple barricades, so actually simpler than last time. But don't get it twisted, this version of the game is 1,000,000 times more enjoyable and expansive. First, starting with the new home, this time there's a second story, doubling the amount of ground, and to unlock the basement, what you need to do is turn off the furnace on the surface floor, which freezes the water on the second floor, allowing us to grab a bell, which we can put on top of a grave the neighbor conveniently kept in his house which I'm not going to question, that opens up a shovel, allowing for us to dig the grave, where at the bottom is a teacher mannequin. Back upstairs, we find a classroom with a bunch of math problems on the front board we solve by collecting numbers around the room, but the mannequin children will throw things, knocking the answers off the wall, so placing the collected teacher at the front will stop them from doing that, which provides us with a toy rifle that in another room we can use to activate a mini carnival game where we shoot at these little guys that rewards us with a key. This key lets us unlock the back of the game, where inside we find a brick wall. From here, using a jackhammer in the upstairs bathroom, that allows us to drill through the wall, and inside we find ourselves the basement key. Then find yourself a crowbar or a hammer around the house, and you're in at last, at least until the neighbor catches us last second and buries us alive for the ending sequence. This Dr. Seuss-esque home is a ton of fun to play through and explore. It's undeniably super creative. This also isn't even the only way to beat the game, as if you sneak all the way into the back of the upstairs, you can actually find the neighbor's security camera room that contains a lockpick, skipping this entire process I just mentioned, which is admittedly 10 times easier, but I enjoy the multiple options. They even added an elevator to give a second way to the upstairs. It's unnecessary, but it adds to this over-exaggerated house in a nice way. As for the villain, Mr. Neighbor, he also has been redone for the far, far better. He still features many of the same themes that made him cool in the last pre-alpha, like adjusting to the player's faults with traps and whatnot, but this time they made him slower, removing his extremely frustrating chase scenes in the last alpha, which inherently makes him more reliant on his AI, sure, but that also feels super improved, as the map with all of its various entries, twists, and turns allows the neighbor not to just chase you in a one-way path, but move around to cut you off at various places, which makes him feel a lot smarter and a lot less annoying in my opinion, which is definitely a welcome change. I think I got the best example of this here, where when trying to go downstairs with the neighbor behind me, he chose to instead jump out of the window and meet me at the bottom, which is really cool. Now, this isn't to say this alpha is perfect. For one, again, it's pretty short, only taking 30 minutes or so to play on first playthrough, and any other time it takes no longer than 5. While the house is definitely designed well here, I noticed the neighbor did struggle to get upstairs a lot of the time and would sometimes become a non-threat entirely, and of course the glitches are still a big problem. But overall, this version of Hello Neighbor is so much more digestible and less frustrating than the last. Maybe to a point where you could argue that the game is a bit easy, but I would much rather have it like this than the neighbor we had previously. But with all this being said, rating it as a snippet of a planned larger game, it's hard to give this version any lower than a 7 or 8 out of 10. Hello Neighbor Alpha 2 is where the game really tries to build a picture for what the final version is supposed to look like. There's a regular mode and a story mode with various cutscenes included. There's elements of a story being built up here, and they also fully refresh the game's art style to have a more cartoony feel, which looking back on, I honestly prefer. For the plot, we pull into our new home, where after a tutorial involving stealing a key from a raven and unbarricading the door, we look around our new place and take a nap, only to have nightmares of the neighbor locking somebody screaming into his basement and hiding the various items we need to find around his house and on his person. Before then, the actual game starts and we try to save whoever he was locking inside of here with simply a key card and a crowbar blocking our path. To do this, again, there's a couple of ways. One way is to first grab the red key off of the neighbor, which can be used to unlock his workbench area containing our crowbar and a lockpick. Out in the neighbor's yard, we can then find a shed, which the lockpick can unlock, revealing to us a wrench that can be used to unlock the guard to his roof ladder here, allowing us on top where there is a hole leading us to the room with the key card giving us all we need. The second way to solve this is to instead turn on the generator in the backyard, flip a switch here which activates a hidden staircase, then use the staircase to go upstairs and grab a magnet which can be used to to take the lockpick from the workbench window that can then unlock the workbench itself without the red key. Then just activate the staircase again, break down the barricades on the upstairs room, and there lies the final keycard. Plus, while these are the main ways, these aren't restrictions on what you can do by any means. These routes can be mixed and mashed around however you please. I mean, if you're into torturing yourself, you could even try building up on the roof instead with the provided boxes. Also, if you're wondering what's in the basement, they tease there being a new area to explore before the game abruptly ends. So a clever tease slash troll to end it off. Now, house-wise, this is pretty well designed. I love the multiple routes. They're super creative, just like the first alpha, just a little bit more realistic minus the hidden staircase. I also love that the game tries to expand into the vertical access more with all sorts of routes to reach the upstairs and utilizing things like outside sheds, generators, and magnet physics to progress us further. Although the first big red flag for this game is in its execution of these processes, as doing all of this can often be super glitchy and frustrating, as items can fall through floors, the climbing mechanics are annoying, and for some reason they made it to where in order to pick up items you have to hold E instead of just tapping it like the first alphas and pretty much any other game, which makes playing an intense game like this 1,000,000 times more frustrating. But while on its own this stuff would be acceptable, we now have to discuss the neighbor, who is by far the worst in this alpha. This time they made him way faster, to the point where he's basically the same speed as the player's own sprint speed, and therefore makes exploring the backyard and other tight places a death trap, which is just no fun. And his AI is a nightmare. This neighbor will spot me from the smallest sliver of a window and then permanently lock on me until I'm either across the street or get caught. And I get that they're trying to make the game more sneak oriented like the pre-alpha. They even added ways to make the neighbor fall asleep and other various tasks to distract him, but when he is this extreme, he is just no fun to play against at all and is extremely frustrating. I'd say just delete him from the game using console commands yourself, because it's genuinely more fun that way, but doing this crashes the game. Like, they knew people would try this and made it impossible. Rating this neighbor game is super hard, because while I enjoy the home design and puzzles excluding the neighbor, he alone makes the experience so much less fun for me that I can't give the game more than a high 4, maybe a 5. Hello Neighbor Alpha 3 is the biggest update so far, but also by far the most controversial. This version once again changed the entire house, making it much larger with countless floors and various different new tasks for the player. Now, this version was hated by many fans at launch, mostly because, for one, they made the game entirely take place at night, I guess to play into the horror aspects a bit more, but in turn, this made everything so dark that without a flashlight or messing with the settings of the game itself, it's extremely hard to see. And of course, there's the gameplay itself, which goes like this. Again, we have an opening cutscene revealing the home, but this time no tutorial or anything. And again, to enter the neighbor's basement, we need a crowbar and a keycard. To solve this, we first have to go into the backyard and grab a magnet, then jump across this door onto a platform, revealing a blue key we can grab with the magnet. And using the key, we can unlock this room containing the keycard. Then in one of the windows, we can climb onto the roof and up a ladder, where at the top is a hole in the ceiling, which using the train tracks on the side, we can jump into, revealing the final crowbar, leading us to the basement, which in this version just teleported the player to a room with the neighbor crying that ends when going near him. So first, regarding the house design, the first thing you'll notice is that they clearly liked the more vertical focus approach of Alpha 2, so much so that a big chunk of this game isn't even really puzzles, but rather parkour. Parkour across the gate, parkour to the blue key, parkour into the roof. It feels like they've sacrificed most of the puzzles, with mostly just jumping around in a game that already doesn't have that great of physics. And also, it feels like the item placements were super random. The key card is just laying around in a random shelf, while the crowbar is just sitting on a pillar of the roof, with no linear path or goal to acquire them like what we had in the first couple alphas. I also had problems like the crowbar not spawning on my first playthrough playthrough, which if it wasn't for me vaguely remembering there was supposed to be something here and looking it up, would have left me thinking it was just another empty room and cost me hours for something I couldn't control. However, I must admit, even though this version is hardly a puzzle game and is borderline a rage game at times, I did still have a lot of fun climbing around the house, seeing how high I could go. It can be pretty difficult or frustrating sometimes, but I don't feel like it's too much, and it was actually a pretty good time exploring the neighbor's castle-sized home. Despite most of the rooms being useless, I still didn't feel like the puzzles were too difficult. But now turning it over and talking about the neighbor himself, again, he is super fast in this version, albeit in a more manageable, larger house, and he also still has the extremely frustrating problem with spotting the player way too easily, which is annoying since it's clear this version of the game is again meant to be more sneak oriented instead of just running around like an animal. But along with these same issues, they also completely revamped the neighbor's kit, giving him throwable glue cans, making it even harder to run away once he catches you, and he goes absolutely crazy with the traps he places this time around. More specifically, the cameras. They will be at every single corner. It doesn't matter what you do or if the neighbor even sees you there, if you walk anywhere, you'll be met with a bajillion cameras the next time around, which completely defeats the purpose of the sneak survival elements when he's gonna see me no matter what through the cameras. Essentially, he's just a more frustrating version of the Alpha 2 neighbor. However, the one huge saving grace to this one's design is that once we get past the upstairs, he will usually no longer bug us and leave us alone. And while I had criticized the first Alpha for not having the neighbor follow the players upstairs enough and being fully involved with every interaction, now that the games are getting longer, this one taking me about an hour to complete, having moments between high tension downstairs where the neighbor is around any corner and low tension moments upstairs where you can slow down and breathe actually keep the game from getting nearly as frustrating as it could have been without this feature. And while, don't get me wrong, the AI sucks, this feature actually makes him more manageable than, say, the Alpha 2 house where you really couldn't escape him. All in all, it's super clear to see why this is such a controversial neighbor version, and while I liked certain parts, I still definitely don't think it's anything great. Probably a high 3 to super low 4 out of 10. We have officially reached the final alpha of Hello Neighbor, Alpha 4. In this version, they completely revamped and shook up the Alpha 3 house, including giving it a day-night cycle, while also adding multiple new locations through the fear minigames and the basement itself, which is now a level. However, this being said, this version once again continues on the downward trajectory. Essentially, to run down the gameplay, again, we start at the third alpha's house with the neighbor in need of a key card and a crowbar. First, to get the key card, in the neighbor's freezer, we can find it frozen into a block. In order to get it, we have to open up the elevator shaft in the back by throwing something at the switch and climb up to the top where the fridge's generator lies, letting us turn it off and causing it to melt. As for the crowbar, after collecting the magnet again and going into the third floor, we can find it connected to some wires, making it red hot. Using the magnet, we can then pick up the crowbar and have to cool it down using various methods. I chose to fill up a bucket of water and pour it on top of it, finally letting us unlock the basement. However, when reaching the bottom, the player finds that this time there is finally a basement level that requires us to jump from extremely far, which is impossible playing normally. However, around the map are two mini games that give us power-ups to help us pass through. For the first mini game, after grabbing a red key conveniently in the back of our trunk, we have to reach the roof of the house by activating the train and stopping it right here so we can parkour on top, then fly into this hanging room where the red key can unlock this door, taking us to our first fear minigame inside of a pantry, which we have to parkour all the way to the top of, where at the end we are given a double jump. For the second minigame, back at the roof, we can find the gears for the wind turbine, where we can throw something inside and a green key will drop in the room below. Head back to the first floor, where by these stairs we can use the green key to unlock this door, taking us to the second minigame inside of a school, where we have to play red light green light with a bunch of mannequins that in the end makes us push away a large mannequin, giving us a shove ability. These power-ups then allow us to go into the basement, parkour across the various areas, and push the neighbor away, taking us to the final room, ending the game. So first, discussing the overworld, the house is a more fleshed out version of the last Alpha 3 house, which I thought would have been a good thing since it leaves room room for more puzzles and maybe an improvement on the parkour, but actually I'd say the opposite has happened here. There are a couple of highlights in the puzzle department. Like, I thought the way to get the crowbar by cooling it down was pretty clever, and I liked stopping the turbine gears by shoving something inside to clog them. However, pretty much the rest of the world is based on parkour or building, and I'd say it's much more frustrating this time around. The title is also ridiculously glitchy. I had a lot of problems with performance and frame drops, and also especially with seemingly simple things like climbing the ladder, something you have to do every single time you want to get on the roof, and in a game as physics-based as this, you'd think they'd get down being able to climb a ladder, but as you can see probably on screen, clearly not. There were also various issues with animations and the game crashing, which just add on to it. Discussing the neighbor, again, he works very similar to Alpha 3, kind of just chasing the player around, spamming cameras like crazy. At this stage in development, the neighbor is not really a part of the game at all. He just serves to annoy the player with every failure as they have to run back to the top of the house. And so any sneak survival aspects remaining in Alpha 3 are completely gone here. He also doesn't really ever follow the player upstairs once again. And while I actually didn't mind this in Alpha 3, as it was short enough to where it felt like there was a good separation between being in danger and out of danger, this alpha features way more upstairs floors, essentially making him even more useless. He's also pretty glitchy. Just look at this clip where he literally accidentally locked himself in the basement. But now I want to discuss the fear minigames, because these things are a nightmare. First off, with the fear school game, it's essentially a super short red light, green light game. Hide from these students while they're moving around, and run when the bell rings and they're sitting down. Simple enough. However, to twist things up, they also added a teacher that will chase the player even if all of these students are sitting down, and is also far faster than the player, meaning if they spot you, it's basically game over. Or in other words, the game is essentially just dying over and over and over to the teacher until one lucky time where they don't spot you and you can make it to the end. It's honestly a pretty creepy environment, and I remember there also being a lot of mystique about what this game was after its demo was found in the Alpha 3 files. So there was a lot of questions about what this would be, and unfortunately, if anything, it just ended up being a luck-based, rage-inducing red light, green light. For the next game, Fear Darkness, things get even worse. As mentioned, we have to climb up a pantry and reach the top. However, they were not messing around with the Fear Darkness label. It is so dark that it is borderline unplayable. I'm going to brighten it up for you guys, but it basically looks like this during the entire playthrough. It's really ridiculous. Not to mention that, like in the overworld, the parkour is just as frustrating, and it involves a ton of physics that don't work well on this game, leading to a lot of glitches and setbacks. I mean, they have a bunch of snack items drop from the pantry during the minigame, and one of them literally soft locked me, forcing a restart instantly. The ending where we grow back to real size and see the pantry around us is pretty cool, but these fear minigames are one of the biggest head scratchers in any game I've ever seen. Why did they add these? People were already starting to get frustrated in Alpha 3 with the big focus on parkour and having to constantly hide and run away from the fast neighbor for hours. So not only did they make those things just as bad, if not worse, in Alpha 4, but they also made 2 mini games that are full embodiments of these games' flaws. So in terms of ratings, this is definitely another not so good neighbor game, and overall I'd probably say it's like a mid to high 3 out of 10. Now we are at the final versions before the release, the betas. Now, I was going to rate these all separately, but the first 2 betas are super similar to Alpha 4, along with there being a bendy crossover, which is still super cool. I wish more games would do something like that. But the beta with the main changes, and the one I'm going to be judging here, is the final one, Beta 3. Again, the game takes place in an even further expanded version of the Alpha 3 home, and to get into the basement, like usual, we need a key card card and crowbar to pass through. To get the crowbar headed upstairs, once again we find it connected to electricity that we have to cool off. This time I just waited around a bit and it was ready. And as for the key card, again it is frozen inside of the fridge. However, looking upstairs, the generator that powers it on is locked behind a cage. And to access it, we have to match the items in this children's room photo in our house with the real thing at the neighbor's, or at least just the hat part, because in my playthrough that's all I needed and it unlocked, letting us turn off the freezer generator and unlock the key card. However, again, to surpass the basement, this time we need to play 3 mini games around his house. Firstly, the new one we can access by just opening the door at the top of this lift, taking us to Fear Supermarket, where we have to hide from mannequins while dragging a shopping cart and collecting the 5 items seen in all of their carts to complete the level, giving us a new sneak invisibility power-up that also unlocks more of the house. For the other 2 mini games, first upstairs we can throw an item into this lever, unlocking a red key, which after again getting into the hung up room on the side, replays a slightly improved version of the Fear Darkness minigame, which again upon completion gives us a double jump. And finally, after finding a phonograph that plays peaceful music, we can go into this room with a bunch of pitching machines shooting at switches back and forth, and block these switches off by playing the music that grows the trees, unlocking a gate here containing a globe, which we could freeze in a fridge and bring it to this globe stand here that for whatever reason freezes a room full of water at the top, letting us grab another phonograph that this time plays intense chase music. We go back onto the roof where the turbine is, now covered in bushes, play the intense music to make them shrink, then go to the gate and break the turbine once more, dropping the green key and letting us play the school minigame. That's again a slightly improved version giving the same ability. Finally, when entering the basement, there's a whole new level we must pass through using our new abilities that finally takes us to a boss battle with the neighbor that soft locks us since they didn't want to add the ending in yet, I guess. So as you could probably tell, this is significantly longer than the last alpha with a much bigger house, and in some ways this is an improvement for sure. The home is again still pretty fun and charming to explore, and they've also put a lot more focus into the puzzles this time around instead of just parkour, which I definitely appreciate the effort of, and it definitely feels good to have those aha moments after putting pieces together. But this being said, that's extremely rare with these puzzles, as they are much more difficult than any other and often make literally no sense. Like the weird globe thing, for instance. How in the world is anyone supposed to figure out you're supposed to grab a globe, put it into a freezer until it's frozen, then put it onto a stand which will freeze the water upstairs, allowing us to cross? Without prior knowledge, it's basically impossible, and while they tried to give the player hints through maps on the walls, I still have no idea how anyone could have figured that out. Plus, the weird room matching one also made no sense, and while I appreciate the effort to make something creative, it makes the game basically unplayable without a guide, because there are so many things in this map, most of which being completely useless or unnecessary, like this cake mannequin thing I didn't mention, where if you spend like half an hour collecting a bunch of mannequins and cakes, you can unlock a rifle that barely helps you, honestly. While on the other hand, seemingly minor things that are scattered around the map, like the phonograph or the globe stand, are vital for playing the game, making it take hours to sift through every room. I played this game for an entire day, and a part of that reason is because, also like with every other neighbor game, this one is extremely glitchy. And while with those, I could write it off as being in an alpha stage and not being that detrimental in games that maybe take 10 minutes to restart in the event something does go wrong, we are now talking about a game that takes hours to beat, and simple things like a switch not working, or according to other people's accounts, items not even spawning in, mean you gotta start back at the beginning, and that includes all of the intro cinematics and the tutorial just to fix their mistakes. It's not fun and it's super punishing, especially the fear mini games, which still are annoying, albeit not as bad as before, but they just feel like a chore rather than being a part of the game. I wish they would add more locks and ways to unlock the basement, instead of making opening the basement the entire core of the game take 10 minutes while collecting the abilities takes hours. Now, this being said, there are still other improvements. The game's art style is more refined, they made some annoying parts of the alphas better, like allowing the switch of the elevator to be opened by hand, made the ladder easier to climb and incremental so you don't fall off and die every time. The neighbor, in my opinion, is relatively improved here as well, as he's still super fast and aggressive, but at least from my experience, he doesn't sit inside of his home as much as earlier alphas. He spends more time outside and away from the entry point, making him a bit more manageable even with the dozens of cameras he places everywhere. But that issue has also been helped, as instead of having to break them or turn off the power, now we can find his camera room and shut it down. This time he can also actually access most of the house himself and will climb around towards you, which makes him feel more present in this version. So while he's still really buggy and extremely frustrating at times, I actually don't think this neighbor version is as bad as I was expecting. Overall, I actually think there was a decent amount of polishing done to make this game a little bit better with the neighbor and the general map accessibility, but it's also probably the worst gameplay we've seen from any neighbor title, and how good the art style is or how fair the neighbor is can only go so far when the puzzles and gameplay in general just isn't all that fun, leaving the betas right around the mid to high 3 out of 10. Here we are at the final version of the first game, Hello Neighbor. In this version, the game is separated into 3 acts. Act 1, which is essentially the Alpha 2 house, Act 2, which is the Alpha 2 house again, but we try to escape it, and finally Act 3, which is more or less just the beta house. To start off the game, this time we play as a young version of the player, whose name, by the way, is Nicky Roth, chasing a ball before encountering the neighbor, whose real name is Theodore Peterson, but from now on I'm still calling him the neighbor, doing something suspicious in his basement, prompting us to try to get in, with the only obstacle being a red key hidden in the upstairs starting Act 1. To get into the basement, first we have to climb upstairs with boxes and break the window to get in, where we can either grab the car key, unlocking the neighbor's trunk with a magnet that can grab a lockpick, unlocking the workbench with a wrench, allowing us to climb onto the roof and into the room with the key. Or cleverly, there's also a second route involving turning on a fan, placing a bowling ball, causing it to roll towards a lift switch, then quickly run outside while it flips, lifting us to the room. Also, after acquiring the key, there's this little basement area where we have to try and escape while the neighbor hunts us down, ending in a chase scene with the neighbor that forces us to get caught. So the first act is actually off to a pretty decent start. The multiple routes and puzzles are actually pretty enjoyable and clever. I did have a good time with these ones, and they weren't too difficult. And while there is building involved in beating the game, which obviously nobody wants, I didn't find it too annoying. So the puzzles are pretty great here. However, the neighbor himself is once again extremely annoying, and trying to explore the interior of his house is basically impossible. It feels almost identical to the Alpha 2's neighbor with its same struggles. Plus, he's also far more annoying in the basement version, as it's super dark and it's pretty easy to get lost in this abyss of a basement, especially when every 2 seconds he spots me and chases me around until I lose where I'm going, so I overall didn't like that part. Plus, this applies to every act in the game, but it's also noticeably glitchier than the betas. I saw the neighbor spaz out a bunch of times, and also objects, for whatever reason, have the tendency to launch the player if they run into it, usually leading to me dying from fall damage. But with that being said, otherwise, Act 1 is actually pretty enjoyable and is off to a good start. Act 2, however, is where things turn really downhill. This time, they cleverly have the player get caught inside of the neighbor's home, and when somebody mysteriously unlocks the door, we then have to try and escape, after the neighbor has upgraded and boarded up his home, that is. Now, despite it being the same house, the game is very different and gives us 3 unique ways to exit. Either by getting the gate key, which involves pulling a bunch of pipe levers that burst a wheel off the pipes that we can spin here, draining the upstairs from its shark-infested waters, letting us cross, giving a shovel that can dig a hole in the backyard, granting a dollhouse key, which we can use to open a dollhouse, actually allowing us to control the real house by opening doors, unlocking this room that allows us to turn the water to freezing, then simply use the wheel to flood the top floor with icy water that takes us to the shed, granting the key. We can also beat this by instead going into the bathroom, where a mini toy figure with a crowbar is, put them in the bathroom of the dollhouse, then go back to the real bathroom where he is now fully sized with a full-size crowbar, which lets us break out of the wooden barricades here. And finally, we can also win by using a wheel to turn various different knobs around the map and go into the back of the neighbor's house and turn the water to steaming in the boiler, which can power this engine that when pulling activates the gears outside, opening a trampoline that can be used to hop out. Now, these puzzles, in my opinion, are some of the most creative in the entire series. I love the dollhouse thing. I love the multiple routes that you can pick. They can be a bit confusing at times, but otherwise they are fine. The issue here is the neighbor. This is the worst state we have ever seen the neighbor. As again, it's still the Alpha 2 house, so the home is relatively small. However, this time a big chunk of the downstairs starts off locked away, meaning there are only a couple of rooms he can occupy. And unlike Act 1, he can access pretty much all of the house no matter what, meaning there will be cameras everywhere and he will be chasing the player constantly. This neighbor is by far the most frustrating neighbor, and while doing these puzzles that, mind you, are not easy and require finding, remembering, and accessing a ton of stuff, he will be catching or trapping you all throughout the way. It's genuinely so infuriating, especially since you can't just run away from him because you're locked in his house. Plus, for story purposes, they started adding death cutscenes that you can get after dying a couple times that are meant to tell the story about the neighbor who lost his wife in a car accident with a pizza truck and then spirals into the person we see today. And these are super important and good cutscenes, but they are really annoying when getting stopped in the middle of a puzzle that you're already frustrated with and forced to sit through them. These would have been much better to see in between acts or something when I'm not already angry and just want to move on. This act is pretty atrocious. It's not fun. It's probably the worst section so far in any game. As for Act 3, it's basically just the beta house from before. It has mostly the same benefits and flaws, although there have been some minor improvements, like making the entire picture puzzle needed to be solved to move on, adding wires so players know where to go in the confusing places, and putting important items that otherwise were laying around the house behind locked doors to make it clear they are items we are supposed to get. So it's slightly more digestible than the betas, even if still pretty annoying. And they also added a new basement sequence that eventually takes us back to the Act 1 chase, with the door now unlocked, which I thought was cool. Plus, they made the final boss beatable, where basically we have to shoot arrows, baseballs, and launch fireworks at the neighbor to cause him to fall over, letting us access the house on his back, taking us to the final scene where us as our adult selves must protect our younger selves from this Shadow Man figure that allows us to wake up realizing all of Act 3 was a nightmare based on the trauma the neighbor gave us as a child. At least that's how I interpreted it. So, ranking the full version of Hello Neighbor. Honestly, the final version shows off a lot of the lowlights of the different versions overall, with the first alpha house, my favorite one, not being included. And while most versions of this game were pretty poor, all of them had pieces that I liked, whether it be the neighbor being improved, or the game being scary, or the puzzles being fun. It just felt like they could never mix them all together to make a great game. Playing all of them over again makes it so obvious why the Hello Neighbor games are both so popular but also so hated, because every alpha has bits and pieces of a genuinely insanely good game, just for it to generally disappoint at the finish line. But as for ranking, what we got is the final product. It's definitely not as bad as people are saying. It's not like an F tier worse than every other alpha we got, but it's also not any better than the decent ones. So overall, I'd say it generally sits around the mid 4 range. But that's pretty much it for the main Hello Neighbor games, and from here the developers would start to work on various different spin-offs, starting with Hello Neighbor Hide and Seek is the franchise's first spin-off, released at the end of 2018, being a prequel to Hello Neighbor before the neighbor had driven into insanity and started locking people in his basement. In fact, this game opens up with a super wholesome start. There's a loving family around the neighbor, including his wife and 2 children, Maya and Aaron. In this game, the 2 kids play various different versions of hide and seek, imagining 5 different worlds, where from the perspective of Maya, we have to to collect various items in a fetch quest to pass the time until dinner, including a jungle biome collecting animal plushes, a city collecting cash as a robber, a burning downtown collecting dolls as a firefighter, an icy graveyard collecting brains as a zombie, and finally a larger version of our home we have to traverse for the final stage, which is a bit different for reasons I'll mention shortly, all while Aaron chases us in appropriately themed costumes. And as neighbor games obviously do, collecting a lot of these items will involve puzzles and traversing around the map. I won't go over all of the collections because there are dozens of them in each world, but some notable examples of this are in the first world, this bird is covering a stuffed animal, so we can climb up to her nest and steal her egg, which causes her to leave the plush alone. In the second world, we can turn the signs on the streets, causing the vehicles driving by to get stopped, containing more money. In the third world, we can place a mattress by a building that drops us survivor dolls. Or in the fourth world, we need to collect brains, but there are other zombies guarding the brains we want, so we can collect a brain and use it to drag them away. Now, the puzzles mentioned here are genuinely really creative and are fun to solve for the most part. And I say for the most part because not all of the levels are created equally, not in the slightest as a matter of fact. The first level's puzzles are a blast, they aren't too hard, and often use creative ways to hide things. I don't have too many bad things to say about the puzzles themselves, other than that sometimes there would be multiple animals laying in the same spot, which is odd because it feels like the devs ran out of time to put them somewhere, so they just put multiple in the same place. The second level's puzzles are alright, but they are extremely spread out, and in this huge city, only a small number of rooms actually do something, which can be really confusing. Plus, you need a ridiculous amount of bags to win, and they don't distribute them very well, as some puzzles take like half an hour to solve just to get a couple bags, while you can just walk into other rooms where you can find piles of them. The reward system definitely feels weird. The third level's puzzles, though, are by far the worst. I absolutely hated this level, as figuring out what to do in this fire-filled world is nearly impossible. Like, for instance, you're somehow supposed to figure out that this is a balloon, and in order to fill it up, we have to use Aaron, who is on fire, by dragging him into the lake, causing steam to go up into the balloon, where we can then ride on top of it, where at the end they drop a bunch of dolls. It's extremely hard to figure out, and it doesn't really make that much sense. While the last main stage, stage 4, is pretty middlebrow. Again, it's a massive world with miles of places to search for items, with most of them taking place in one room. And with this being said, one thing that weighs all of these maps down, in my opinion, is their general size. Since, as mentioned, these maps are humongous, meaning that while trying to figure out puzzles or rule things out, the player has to traverse so much ground that it can literally take hours to search every spot. And this is made especially more frustrating when talking about our new antagonist, Aaron, who chases us around just like the neighbor did in the first game, which is fine. There's actually a bit of improvements with this version, like that hiding somewhere will make him go away no matter what, instead of him just pulling us out every time like in other games. And he doesn't lock onto the player as annoyingly as the main neighbor games, although that can be very map dependent, as in some maps like the Night City, where there are tons of twists and turns, and also a game mechanic where if cardboard cutouts see us roaming, they will call over Aaron by blowing a whistle. It makes him much more predictable and manageable in a good way, while other maps like the stage 1 and stage 4 that are mostly open lead to him spotting us constantly from across the map and chasing us down, degrading the experience. But with all this being said, there is one singular feature that makes the gameplay 10 times more infuriating. See, they needed to add a punishment for dying too many times, because otherwise Aaron would just be a nuisance that takes us back to the beginning and nothing more. So sometimes when we die, Aaron will sneak into our basket and take our items, spreading them across the map at random. Meaning you don't just have to solve all of the puzzles from before, but you also have to search the entire map all over again to see where he hid them, which again can take like an hour just to get back to where we started. And this isn't like a rare once or twice thing. I had this actively destroy multiple runs on each stage. Like on stage 3, for instance, I was literally running to the basket with the last item and I got caught, spreading a large chunk of the dolls around the map when I was just seconds from being done. The best option in this case is to just restart from the beginning, so you at least know where the dolls are, but it makes getting chased by Aaron genuinely nerve-wracking, with the risk of losing sometimes hours hours of progress if caught. But not in a fun way, more like in a I'm going to break my monitor if this stupid kid catches me one more time kind of way. So the gameplay overall is alright, but it's super hit or miss. Some levels are fun and some levels are genuinely miserable. Although it would be unfair to not mention that regardless, the levels all look really good. I love seeing the Hello Neighbor art style in so many different themes, so that at least helps with the angering puzzles a bit. But none of this mentions what I think is the best part of the game I've conveniently left out: the story and the ending. See, like I said, at the start, the core plot is just that we are imagining playing games as the neighbor's children in a loving and happy family. But this family dynamic doesn't always stay this way, as midway through each level, there are various cutscenes that tell a genuinely tear-jerking story. After starting and beating the first stage, we get a cutscene of Maya and Aaron eating together and sharing the larger spoon they have, painting how good and healthy their relationship was. However, during the second game, when dinner time hits, the kids look outside to see that nobody was home and their parents had yet to have returned. This was disappointing, but they are still optimistic just with themselves and have a good time. After a little bit, they start to get worried, but Aaron suggests they play another game to pass the time. However, after this third game, things take a dark turn, as while they are playing, the neighbor comes home and drops their mother's purse on the ground, symbolizing that she wasn't coming home with him. He isn't able to keep his feet below him and falls to his knees in devastation. This is meant to represent the cutscene from the first game where after a car accident she had died, and this was him coming home right after it happened, devastating the family. They make dinner once again, but without their mother, and as Maya goes through the home seeing how dark things have become, she visits her brother, who was just as depressed and his optimism was slowly starting to dwindle. Fortunately, Maya this time is able to get him to play one more game using the toy rifle to try and cheer him up a bit. But this quickly goes too far, as afterwards he begins to aggressively attack her with it. Once more, they eat dinner together, and instead of sharing the large spoon, Aaron steals the spoon from her aggressively and pushes her over, getting kicked from the dinner table, but not before stealing Maya's doll that she was using to comfort herself throughout the tragedy. When Maya confronts him, he suggests one final game of hide and seek for the doll, this time bringing us to a larger, more expansive version of the home from the perspective of a child. And after parkouring around and reaching the roof, there we see it, the doll we had been looking for. We go over to the edge of the roof and reach for it, reuniting and giving it a hug. However, while doing so, Aaron reveals himself angrier than ever, circling around, and eventually accidentally giving Maya a shove backward and off of the roof. This was no longer imagination or a game, but real life. Immediately, he realized what he did, but it was too late. Maya fell off of the home and slowly drifted away from her brother, fading the game into black, and then the credits roll, while the neighbor, now with his iconic black gloves from the first game, is forced to dig the grave of his own daughter right after losing his wife. This ending is genuinely powerful, as it fully explains the motives of the first game. All of this grave imagery is because the neighbor was surrounded by death, and the person he was locking in his basement turned out to be his own son. After all, it was the last family member he had left, and he needed to protect them by any means. Obviously, they had alluded to this in the first game, but seeing it play out in these cutscenes and expand on it more is really wonderful, as it flips the entire way you look at the first game, immediately making the neighbor a sympathetic anti-hero rather than a cynical villain, while also telling a voiceless but super powerful story about the long-term negative effects of trauma, which is a much bigger message than what you'd expect from a game like Hello Neighbor, but it's done well nonetheless. Also, them foreshadowing this ending in the first game through one of the mid-game interludes is absolutely awesome. The game itself, when it comes to how fun it is honestly only alright at best and extremely annoying at worst, and I would rate this game like a high 4 or 5 without this story, but the great storytelling between acts, showcasing the rapid descent of the family, bumps it up quite a bit for me to like a 6 or 7 out of 10. Here we have one of the most interesting games in the franchise, Secret Neighbor. Secret Neighbor was released in 2019 after a beta and is a social deduction multiplayer game, where we actually play as a bunch of children trying to infiltrate the neighbor's basement, having to find key cards to unlock different rooms in the mega home, and eventually collect keys to open the basement and escape. The only thing is, one of the children isn't a child and is instead the neighbor in disguise, in charge of hindering the kids' progress while also leading them into places alone and kidnapping them to hopefully stop their journey. The various different children get their own abilities, like being able to shoot things or hold extra items, along with the neighbor, who can also be swapped around for various different antagonists from future games, and there's other maps outside of the neighbor's home to shake things up a bit. Essentially, it's just Among Us but Hello Neighbor. Granted, this game actually came well before Among Us got popular, so they actually beat the internet to the craze. But then you might be wondering why this game never caught all of the hype, and the answer is pretty simple. It's not really all that good. Now, I do like some things. I think the maps are at least generally creative, and it's cool to have randomly swapping keys around the areas to essentially allow there to be infinite amounts of ways for the game to be played, which in a lot of ways is great for fans of the Hello Neighbor franchise. However, after playing the game a couple times, there's one really big issue, which is that it gets really boring really quickly. There aren't any puzzles or anything to shake up the gameplay, and it literally is just looking for keys every time, which unsurprisingly gets really stale after a couple playthroughs. They do kinda try to address this by making us collect key cards or crowbars to access different parts of the map, but those you also just find by looking around the map and end up being more of an annoyance if anything. And the game would have benefited a lot more with an Among Us type task system to keep things fresh. Instead of just grabbing keys from drawers, it would be cooler if we had to complete small tasks as a group and then unlock the keys. Plus, with the title being a social deduction game, it inherently requires the people you're playing with to be social. But this is nearly impossible, at least in the current state of the game. There are often just dozens of players on at a time globally, and 99.99% of people I played with never talk or do anything to progress the game when it comes to figuring out who the neighbor is. Meaning, most of the time, unless you have a full lobby of friends, there aren't really any social parts to it. You just kind of have to hope and pray the neighbor doesn't get you. And if you're playing as the neighbor, most of the time the teams aren't organized enough to really notice if somebody goes missing or you turn into the neighbor real quick and catch somebody. However, in the rare event that the children are organized, it's basically unplayable as the neighbor because, like I said, there's no tasks or anything that require them to separate like what you see in most social deduction games, so they can usually just stick together 99% of the time, making picking them off basically impossible. The game mostly shines when playing with friends, and while I used to play this with friends a lot back in the day and had a good time, nowadays it's really hard to get a large group together to play this when, mind you, it costs $20, especially when it gets boring after just a couple of playthroughs and barely has any players. It's also a bit frustrating that with the game's price, there's a big focus on microtransactions, which would be acceptable in a free game. Obviously, they have to make money somehow. But in one price like this, and with servers as inactive as they are, it's a bit crazy to be asking people for more money. So overall, rating the game is honestly kind of hard because the servers are so dead and nobody even really plays it how they're supposed to, and it gets boring so fast anyway. I guess it's kind of a bad time to rate a game like this that's almost 6 years old now and hasn't gotten an update in a while, but rating at least what we have now, I'd say it's like a high 3 to maybe 4 out of 10 if I'm being generous. I definitely don't recommend getting this game unless you and a group of friends are playing it together. Also, I must mention that they later on would port the game onto Roblox, which is just a buggier, less polished version, although it is free, so if you're trying to get a group together, this is probably the best option. So the Hello Guest prototype is probably one of the most interesting Hello Neighbor games, at least in how it released. In December 2019, the developers would hide a URL inside of Secret Neighbor that, when entering, would download a game locked by a passcode, where after completing an extremely long ARG in the game to unlock an 80-digit code, we could then use it to unlock and download the game Hello Guest prototype, taking us to this mysterious mysterious blue-tinted abandoned theme park, where our job as the player was to go around the theme park and stop vandals from destroying the equipment, while also exploring and trying to find secrets, with the main enemy being a brand new character, the Guest, who would chase us around like a weeping angel, coming towards us while we looked away and running away when we turned around, get caught by him and lose time on the day and lowered sanity, which has the bonus real life effect of immediately making you nauseous. At the end of each night, the player would earn money based on how many vandals they stopped, and then a store sequence let us buy items to improve and help with exploring. To beat the game, we can find a powered down roller coaster attraction inside of the park that we needed to turn back on. To do this, after climbing up an untextured wire to the roof and jumping across into this room, we are met with the roller coaster's power source that needed gas. Then, when going to the store, we needed to purchase a bunch of gas to fill it up, allowing us to power it on, but first we have to turn off all of the leaking pipes around the room in a short amount of time to keep it from powering off, then simply ride the roller coaster through, revealing a creepy cutscene that at the end took us to a rocket ride in a wall right in front of it, then just buy a fuse from the store and put it in the fuse box, which activates the ride, allowing us to use the control panel to lift it up and launch it towards the wall, revealing in an end cutscene the weather station, also known as the Mayak house, which I know is important for the lore, I just don't remember how. Plus, there's also a negative ending where spend too many days, the Guest will instead blow up the house. Now, the gameplay itself, at least in its puzzles, is honestly not amazing this time around. Again, it suffers with the issues hide and seek had with being such a large and expansive world that is extremely confusing for new players, since there's only a couple of rooms that actually matter to the game, and for everything else, you're just kind of searching around for nothing. And also, as I'm sure you can tell, this title is extremely unfinished. Less than any other Neighbor game since the pre-alpha. Most objects have no textures, a lot of them are just white rectangles, and it's as easy to break or cheat the game as just jumping across to the final section, although outside of the puzzles, there are still a lot of pluses with this gameplay, mostly in the concept, as I love the idea of having to do a job while also finding time to sneak around and seeing what we can find and the obstacles encountered, then being able to go to the shop and buy items as needed. It's a really fun and unique concept. It's almost like Five Nights at Freddy's mixed with Repo, if that makes sense. Plus, for what the gameplay lacks in its depth and clarity, they more than make up for it with the antagonist, the Guest, and the environment he is around. The Guest AI is still pretty glitchy like the Neighbor, often acting weird and inconsistent, but the Weeping Angel function works really well in this game, constantly keeping me on my toes, knowing he could be right behind me at any moment. It makes it a genuinely scary Neighbor game, unlike anything we've seen since the pre-alpha, especially when it's matched by a super creepy environment. The abandoned theme park looks visually pretty cool and super eerie, even if a lot of it is unfinished. Plus, while how much weight you put on this is extremely subjective, there's also something to be said about the game being so niche and hard to access at the time. It almost gives it a sense of like we're playing a leaked game or something we're not supposed to have. The lack of polish when it comes to the designs or the audio, dare I say, adds to the horror, making it feel more mysterious like I mentioned earlier. Now, to be honest, the puzzles and the general gameplay severely weigh the game down, as obviously they're glitchy, hard to understand, and are borderline impossible to beat without a guide or prior knowledge. And if you weren't there for the initial discovery of this game, you probably won't feel those same vibes as I do that make it so interesting to me personally. But regardless, despite its flaws, it's definitely one of the most creative and interesting titles so far. I'd say it's a 6 out of 10. Following the reveal of this weird, mysterious prototype in 2019, we would finally get ourselves the first actual released version of Hello Guest in June of the following year, Hello Guest Alpha 1. This time, we actually play as new characters, either Quentin or Beatrix, your choice, and they've added a ton here, including a new art style, an entirely new map and objective, and overall a game that makes for one of, if not the best Hello Neighbor experience yet. yet. The gameplay loop itself is similar to the prototype in terms of chasing vandals out of a theme park to collect money and go to the store to buy items, but also far improved. After picking a character and watching a cutscene of them going into the abandoned theme park, we have to go into our office and clock in. From here, there is a locked off part of the park that it's our job to try and access. To do this, first we have to parkour to the top of our office, where inside are a ton of items to help us out, including the key to the area. And upon unlocking it, we are met with a tall locked tower that needs to be powered on with a generator. To do this, we need to go to the tram station on the other side of the map, jump on top of it, and go into this room where there is a generator here, or buy one ourselves in the shop along with a bunch of wires, and we can plug in the generator here. To open the first door, we then press the first button, and we enter the lighting up code seen here into the dials, unlocking it. However, when going to the top of the tower using the fire extinguisher that in this version can make us fly, by the way, we see another locked door and another code entry. However, obviously this time it's out of view from the dials next to the generator. So we then need to purchase/collect a camera and a monitor, allowing us to place a camera by the lights, select the second door option on the generator, and using the monitor enter the lights like the first one. Opening the final door, we can then fly up and out of, that takes us out of the park and into a cutscene where a man in a hat ambushes us and ends the alpha. So first, for starters, the gameplay with this alpha is significantly improved. It's more polished, the puzzles are still a bit confusing to solve on first playthrough, but nowhere near as bad as the first game, and most importantly of all, it is super fun. A lot of the positives of the prototype are here, like with the dealing with the vandals and whatnot, but the items have been expanded wildly. For instance, the shop is still super important for buying items and upgrades to make beating the game easier, but they also added a lot of crucial items around the map to reward the player for exploring. Furthermore, there's a lot of experimental stuff in this game that isn't required, like buying lights that scare the guest away, but the coolest part of the game, even if unnecessary, is at the top of the tram area, they even added a mixer that can be powered on and used to mix various items together to create new ones. These things by no means are required and are barely useful for beating the actual game, but it's so much fun to just explore and see what can be created from these. The gameplay definitely isn't perfect, as the guest has noticeably been pushed down a couple pegs and isn't a huge threat, while there are still major polishing issues like them not realizing giving the player the ability to fly means they could just fly to the exit, or them not fully fleshing out the tram area when in the files it was clearly meant to have more use, including it even moving. But it's still a lot of fun, and also, might I say, this is by far the most gorgeous game yet. The green foresty vibes here are visually extremely appealing. Ratings wise, this is by far the highest quality looking game in the Neighbor franchise, and despite having areas that are incompleted or items that are unfinished, it still feels like a very high quality Neighbor game, dare I say the highest quality Neighbor game. They even added a reference to the prototype here, which is bonus points in my eyes. Now, I'm not gonna act like I'm not a little biased, because this was one of the first games that I ever made videos on back in 2020, which I'm really nostalgic about.
What is going on, guys? It is Amateur, and today we are back with another brand new Hello Guest video.
And so that probably affects the score for me a bit, but regardless, me personally, I absolutely love this game. It's probably a high 7 to low 8 out of 10. Here we are with the very first version of Hello Neighbor 2 Alpha 1. After Hello Guest Alpha 1, there were rumors of an Alpha 2 being developed, including some behind the scenes animation found showing an extended version of the first version's ending. However, when the next Neighbor version was ready in the summer of 2020, we were surprised that they were working on Hello Neighbor 2, releasing its very first version, Alpha 1. In this version, Quentin is once again back investigating what happened to the neighbor who had gone missing, as we come across the guest from Hello Guest outside of a worn down Alpha 2 home, locking up his attic, a direct flip of what we saw in the main games with the basement. And just like old times, we have to unlock the attic by collecting a crowbar and a key. To beat the game, first starting with the crowbar, it's locked behind this gate upstairs, and to get it, we have to catch the guest entering the code inside while walking in, and then use the code ourselves to collect the crowbar. As for the key, it is defended in flames from the guest's fireplace, which he spends most of his idle time stoking with trash found around his house. All we have to do is put out the flame, either by tossing water into it, waiting the fire out manually while distracting the guest, or other methods like removing all of the trash from his home, causing it to go out, which when doing so reveals the key, letting us open the door. Finally, grab something to help us into the attic like a rope or a generator and swing or climb inside, where we find and grab a guest suit, and outside then see the neighbor waiting for us, ending the alpha. So first, regarding the puzzles, while I don't hate them this time around, I actually appreciate how straightforward they are compared to other neighbor versions. They are sometimes pretty boring or annoying to solve, as they mostly involve waiting around for the guest to either enter a code or waiting around for the fire to burn out, which both takes forever and can be super irritating thanks to this new guest AI, which I'll address shortly. But to temperament this problem, there are various side quests and ways to speed up these processes, like the aforementioned water bottles, and one of the key selling points of the game, the open world, where instead of going to a shop or in the home to collect all of the items we need, certain items can be found outside of the home around the neighborhood to make this easier, which, to give them credit, is a great idea, and it's only Alpha 1, so I don't expect this element to be fully fleshed out yet or anything, but at least for rating this game version objectively, the open world elements are extremely bare bones and unnecessary. There isn't much incentive to leave the neighbor's home, and if you do, most of the items you collect are generally not worth your time. Outside of the puzzles though, clearly the devs listened to at least some of the criticisms of the first game, as this time around the physics are decently improved, working pretty similar to Hello Guest, but including some new features like being able to grapple onto anything close and no longer dying from fall damage, rather just dropping and having a longer animation. So those are some really positive changes and make traversing around the area no longer too frustrating. It's actually pretty satisfying if anything, especially for the last bit where we have to get creative with the physics to reach the attic by swinging around like a monkey inside or building up ways to the top ourselves. The environment is also quite nice. It's clear a lot of the game was copy pasted from Hello Guest, including the pretty visuals, which is a plus. But now discussing the main show, the guest, well, he's an interesting story. In the first couple alphas of Hello Guest, they did a great job at building this creepy new foresty character that lurked in the theme park without really any reason. However, in Hello Neighbor 2, they removed his weeping angel mystique in turn for a more traditional neighbor-like game style, but the way they designed him make him both annoying to play against and also removed any of the horror I mentioned before. This time around, the guest, just like the neighbor, loves to lock onto the player like crazy. Again, it's the small Alpha 2 house with an oversensitive AI. It works pretty similar to the previous neighbor builds, but the main new issue this time around is that they make the guest much more interactive than the neighbor was before, and what he's doing in the house is extremely important, forcing us to keep a good eye on him in case he tries to enter the code or grab some trash to fuel his fire, which could be a good idea if done correctly. But with his oversensitivity, not only does he make solving the puzzles pretty annoying when he's actively chasing after us, but a lot of the time he makes them take ages, as with the code thing in specific, it's such a dice roll on when he will enter the code, and when he finally does, you better not miss it, or worse, have him find you while doing it, because he will drop everything and beeline towards you instantly, forgetting the code entirely. Also, when he does catch you, they uniquely add in an animation where he picks the player up and tosses them from the home, allowing the chance for him to trip and fall, or letting us throw something at him ourselves. But this is severely glitchy and ends up being a nuisance more than anything, especially since when throwing us, we drop all of our items, which are always super annoying to try and pick up, especially when he can just relock on us over and over again until we run away. I get that they wanted to add some kind of punishment punishment for dying, but this just comes off as annoying. Another upsetting element about the guest is, like I mentioned, any horror elements that he had in the past alphas are completely lost in this version, as they gave him the ability to trip and fall when walking over various different items in his house, which they clearly overturned the dial on, as he ends up just ragdolling all over his porch a lot of the time, which, don't get me wrong, is hilarious, but it takes the guest from this feared demonic being to a cute little bird flopping around as he tries to collect the trash for his fire. Something I did like, though, is that instead of cameras or other traps, now the guest places these ball machines that shoot and stun the player when walking past them. They're annoying when they're placed in bad spots, but far from obnoxious unlike the rest of his kit. Overall, I don't hate this game. It could be pretty fun, especially when compared to some of Hello Neighbor's initial alphas, but it is a significant step down from what I thought was shaping up to be a historic comeback in Hello Guest. It's a decent 5 out of 10. Hello Neighbor 2 Alpha 1.5 is an update to the original alpha, specifically for Halloween, that adds a bunch of theming around the game and also includes quite a bit in terms of new puzzles. As this time, while we still have to access the attic with a key and a crowbar, to unlock it, we have to first get the crowbar, which can be done by grabbing the generator and wire from earlier at the gas station, switching this conveyor belt to go backwards by throwing something at the switch, then quickly sneaking inside of the room to grab a fire extinguisher, and then by the upstairs there's another conveyor belt here we can activate with the generator, and can shoot a crowbar on the shelf above to be dragged outside of the conveyor belt that we can then go and grab behind his house. As for the key, once again it's in the gas furnace. However, this time the way to get it is to simply go back into his room to flip the switch backwards, causing the trash to go away from the fire, then simply distract the guest by throwing things, chasing him around, or even glitching him like what I did here, and use the fire extinguisher to speed in the process, giving the key. However, this time when reaching the basement, there are a couple of trick-or-treaters that are in need of some candy, 5 pieces in fact. And this time around, the devs attempt to take more advantage of the outside open world of the game, as in 5 of the buildings around the neighborhood, we have to parkour up or solve basic puzzles to collect these said pieces, then give them to the children, leading to the game's ending where the neighbor is seen in the attic panicked, and it flashes to Quentin in his house, which is where it ends. Now, 90% of the things I mentioned about Hello Neighbor 2's first alpha apply to this game. The guest is still absolutely wonky, the game's physics are solid, but also a bit wonky. Like, for some reason, if you use the fire extinguisher to fly, you can launch yourself at 1,000 miles an hour, and the home's design is pretty similar. The only real difference in this one outside of visual theming is the gameplay, which honestly is a bit more frustrating than the first alpha, as most of the things we have to do are in the room where the guest spends most of his time, so he tends to just constantly annoy me and drag me around, and while the collecting candy thing is kind of fun, it comes off as a bit unnecessary. Although I can't be too hard on this title, as it's just a bonus update to hold things off for the season. Overall, it's a slightly different, and I'd say ever so slightly worse version of Alpha 1. It's a high 4 out of 10 for me. After over a year of waiting for the next entry into the Hello Neighbor 2 saga, on April 7th, 2022, the devs would launch the game for pre-order for a jaw-dropping $40 or $60 for the full version with promised DLC. And with this came a beta version of Hello Neighbor 2, taking us to a completely different setting, where after a short tutorial, Quentin drives into town investigating the suspicious neighbor who now resided in this massive museum-esque house, while his original second alpha house was being raided by the police. After sneaking into the original's basement and grabbing a crowbar, we could then access the neighbor's new home and find there are 3 animal heads we needed to collect to unlock this attic pick, letting us into his attic being the main goal of the game. However, while the previous alphas had only teased there being open world elements, this game is the first one to fully make that transition, as in order to unlock the heads, we have to visit 3 different homes around the the neighborhood and solve puzzles. The taxidermist house, who we can grab some blueprints for a fish head from his door and place them on his workbench, where he eventually crafts it and brings it out to use for target practice where we can steal it. The mayor's house, where we can find a record that plays soft music, put it into his record player, then wait for him to go to sleep, where we can sneak into his locked room and pick up the bear head over his bed. Then finally there's the baker's bakery, where we can grab a lockpick from the kitchen and use it to unlock this pretzel key, which then can be used back at the neighbor's home to unlock this room with a fridge containing the final boar head, which altogether unlock the attic, where we see a shadow of a child before the game ends. Now, I actually reviewed this beta when it first released back in 2022 and was quite aggressive and harsh with it, mostly discussing how angry I was having paid $60 for a beta that was only an hour long and wasn't really promising towards a final version, in my opinion, especially since there was such a big marketing push around things like the AI, which I'll talk about in a moment. However, looking back on this beta as just a game and not under the lens of all of the hype and build up leading up to it, I actually ended up eating my words a bit because I think it's pretty decent. There's a significant environmental upgrade in this game. They do a great job with the graphics and especially the music. There is a decent amount of world building with these mechanics in the game, with different areas having different vibes, including the neighbor's home, which has some super chilling music, along with the sounds of children screaming, building the tension and horror around what could be hiding inside. I also thought the puzzles were pretty decent. Despite the game being open world, they do a good job at making it obvious what the player needs to do through paintings and whatnot, showing where items will be hiding. And a lot of the puzzles themselves are pretty cool, like when we have to make the mayor go to sleep using the music. Although, I will admit, some of the puzzles feel a bit lazy, like having to just grab a lockpick to complete the bakery section, or just placing a blueprint down and waiting for the taxidermist to do all the work in his home. They don't take full advantage of all of this new space, although I'll definitely take these underdeveloped puzzles over the unfinished ones we got while working on the original neighbor betas, where they failed to implement a lot of the crucial details and clues to solve them, leaving them feeling extremely confusing. There are definitely still a fair share of issues with this game though, as immediately I could tell another reason for my disappointment in this game back when it first released was the AI. The devs made the AI of this game more of a key selling point than ever before, releasing demonstrations and everything to flex the future of what we can expect from Hello Neighbor, when in all reality, the AI is still extremely buggy. They often have no idea what they're doing in the slightest. The only real new feature these AIs have is the ability to cut the player off better, which is nice and even reminds me of what we had in the original Alpha 1, but sometimes it even struggles to do that, and there's no elements of the AI improving over time like the first game. Not that those features really ended up panning out. I actually prefer the overall gameplay loop without the constant traps and whatnot in this beta, but it does remove a lot of the novelty of what made Hello Neighbor cool, and at its core, the AI often feels buggy, non-sentient, and at best, average. Overall, while I understand a lot of the disappointment when it came to the marketing and build-up of this game, especially with its crazy $40 price tag, playing the game retrospectively without all of the hype and expectations, I actually thought this was one of the better Neighbor games. Although I did find it weird that the guest, who was advertised as like the main dude for multiple versions, is nowhere to be found in this game, spare for the occasional reference and jump scare when swerving off of the tutorial. Otherwise, it's a low to solid 7 out of 10. We are now at the final version of Hello Neighbor 2 before its full release, the playtest. This final pre-release version takes us back one more time to the classic cat and mouse neighbor style in the Alpha 2 house, occupied once again by the neighbor, where this time we have to find 4 keys to enter the basement. The first one is gotten by unlocking this safe using the color banners above and the color-coded writing on the hopscotch drawing in the ceiling to come up with the passcode giving us scissors, allowing us to cut this pillow here, revealing the first key. For the second key, at the bottom of the shelf, we can see a robot statue sitting in a certain pose, and inside of it is an arm. Find the statue in real life and match it to the shape to reveal a lever, which can be used on the bear to lower the second key. The third key can be found by finding 5 crooked frames around the house and switching them all quickly to unlock the hidden room beneath the stairs with the third key. Then, for the last key, there are 3 action figures of the neighbor neighbor and his 2 children around the map. The neighbor is laying out in the kitchen, Aaron is laying in a vent that can be opened by taking the wrench from the neighbor's waist and unlocking it. Then for the daughter Maya, throughout the house there are a couple map pieces that can be collected and placed here, revealing that there is something hiding behind the barn across the road. Grab the shovel from the neighbor's backyard and head to the treasure, where after digging it up we find the Maya figure. Take the 3 of them and put them on top of this figure house and unlock the final key, ending the playtest. Now this version of the game, despite it not being really talked about that much, is actually pretty good. The puzzles, first off, work out pretty well. I thought they were fun, creative, and were by no means too difficult, which is something I can't really say about a lot of the other neighbor games. They definitely nailed the puzzles on the head with this one. I also love how, while I haven't mentioned it for the past few neighbor versions, this random cat named Ember has been roaming about all the other games and finally makes an appearance in this one, blocking off one of the map pieces, which we can move by giving them food. Now, despite the puzzles being pretty good, the neighbor still leaves a bit to be desired, as this is still the cramped Alpha 2 house, and the neighbor this time around doesn't really ever go outside or have any other distracting tasks other than sitting in view of the front door. So while he isn't annoyingly fast or anything like that and leaves us alone if we go anywhere out of reach, he does tend to chase the player around a bit more than I'd like, but nothing bad. Overall, this playtest is simple, small, but by all means a great time, and if you can get your hands on it, I really recommend it. It's a high 7 out of 10 for me. We are finally at the full release of Hello Neighbor 2. Now, I should note I am playing the most recent version of the game, and apparently there have been updates since the last time I played it in 2022 when it released. And while the different betas and demos leading up to this have been shockingly solid, this game has unfortunately left me extremely disappointed. The game essentially is an extended version of the beta build, where after investigating the Alpha 2 house once more as Quentin, we uncover a paper from the neighbor's son, Aaron, asking for help. And like previous builds, we then try to access the neighbor's attic by going into each home around the neighborhood and solving puzzles, this time to get keys and other items to unveil the attic and its secrets. Where after reaching the attic, we finally find Aaron. However, the neighbor catches us and instead locks us in the attic, where we then have to break out of his house to save Aaron. And when doing so, the neighbor ends up getting crushed by his chandelier, which forces his son to stay and watch after his father, as we get knocked out by a mysterious being, ending the game. Now, the first big issue I have with this final version is the open world, which, while pretty bare in the betas and especially the alphas, allowed us to at least explore the world freely and in any order, no restrictions. However, in the final game here, every area is locked off and are slowly unlocked one by one as we need them, which essentially takes all of the open world elements out of the game and realistically just separates it into acts like the first one. Although chances are they probably did this because without it, it would make the puzzles even more confusing than they already are this time around. I'd argue that the puzzles in this game are some of the worst out of all of the sequel versions leading up to it. For one, at the start when we break into the Alpha 2 house, it's essentially the playtest house from before with similar puzzles and objectives. However, instead of a neighbor, we are avoiding a police officer, along with them changing some of the puzzles a little bit, specifically adding an upstairs, which despite the small change makes things quite a bit less fun, since it caused me to get stuck up here with the cop constantly, which can be really annoying, especially when most of the new puzzles involve searching every nook and cranny for various items or switches hiding in plain sight, only to be interrupted constantly by the cops. So out of the gate, that's a slight downgrade. As for the 3 main houses we travel throughout the game, the first place being the bakery is probably the best of the 3. We basically just have to collect all of the numbers to fix the baker's cash register, and I didn't find these puzzles to be too annoying, and the AI was at least bearable here. The second location with the taxidermist, conversely, is one of the worst sections we've gotten in the entire franchise, as this time we have to collect a code to unlock this safe outside of his home. However, to do that, we have to do all sorts of annoying stuff, including flipping a bunch of boar heads around the house, collecting the letters to his fridge, and other frustrating stuff, which wouldn't inherently be that bad if it weren't for the horrific design of this house and the AI to go along with it. The puzzles in the beta were short enough that I didn't really spend too much time in any of the houses, but in this fully fledged game, their flaws really show here. The taxidermist is constantly chasing me around, and it's rare to find any point in my entire playthrough where he's not actively chasing me. There's also this weird thing that applies to all the AIs I thought I'd mention here, where even if they don't see me, they will still drift towards my location, and a lot of the time will literally stand right behind the doors I try to enter waiting for me, to the point where sometimes if I go from door to door, especially in this location, the taxidermist will move across them waiting for me. It's really frustrating, and this part absolutely sucks. As for the third location, the mayor's house, we have to collect all of his trophies to then get a wheel that opens up this weird hidden room. And in this one, the AI isn't as bad as the house is pretty large, but still the chase sequences are seemingly constant and the puzzles are often pretty confusing as well. And then finally, for the neighbor's home at the museum, after finishing each puzzle in all of the other locations, we unlock various pieces to help us make progress at the neighbors, working as our sort of hub world, which I actually think is pretty well done. And I also think for how large the museum is, the devs do a decent job at drifting the player in the right direction, albeit from a couple puzzles like this one where we needed to get TV signal for a code, so we have to climb above the TV, grab a satellite, and readjust the satellite on the roof to get a code. I would have never figured this out without a guide or prior knowledge, because the satellite is super tucked away and they don't really hint at where it is or anything like that. And speaking on that, above all, I think that is probably the largest issue with this game. They advertised it as being such a big selling point of this title and so much more improved compared to the first game, when in all reality, it's realistically just as annoying. The AI in all of these characters are noticeably overly sensitive to everything, as much as just opening doors will set them off sometimes, which is so frustrating because when I do try to sneak, there's no use since they'll always find and spot me. I don't know how much this existed in the betas and whatnot, but those were fortunately short enough where I didn't really notice it. But in the full game, the AI just lives to be rage bait, and other than that, I can't even really find any other notable changes to the AI from the beta and playtest, which is really disappointing. The game is also way too short for its retail price of $40 without any of the DLC, when it only takes a couple of hours to beat, but also at the same time, if it were any longer, the game would just drag more than it already does. So it really feels like the devs struggle the most to translate this neighbor format into a fully fledged professional game, no matter how promising the demo versions were. But it's not like they didn't have material to make the game bigger. I mean, whatever happened to the guest? He isn't here at all, at least until being added in later patches through bonus modes. Now, these things being said, I actually don't hate this version of the game. It's by no means awful. A lot of the good things from the earlier versions, like the physics most of the time, the graphics, and the music still stand out. The game feels a lot more polished and more expensive, if that makes sense, than especially the first full game. So I can give them credit for all of that, and I don't even think the game is bad per se. I just have mostly angled this review negatively because it is extremely disappointing as a final product when most of the benefits are things we already had in the earlier games. So with that being said, that's why Hello Neighbor 2 is unfortunately a high 4 to low 5 out of 10. Hello Neighbor 2, with its launch, also had various different DLCs released alongside, also at an extra cost each. There's Back to School for $15, which takes place in a school with a janitor and his various dogs. Late Fees, also for $15, which takes place in a library with, of course, a librarian. Hello Guest, or Patch 9, which isn't technically a buyable DLC, it was just an added free bonus side quest after release to the main game featuring the guest. Then there's Helicopter, which is just a DLC that adds a bonus helicopter camera to the base game for an additional $6. It's crazy they even paywalled this, but with it being an item, I can't review it. They also released all of this in a deluxe version for $20 more than the base game, making it $60 for the full product. These DLCs, specifically the buyable ones, have a very interesting history, being released with the full game as mentioned, but were almost unanimously hated for being extremely unfinished. So much so that Steelwool Studios, the ones who apparently made these DLCs, also known for Security Breach and other FNAF titles, later on removed their branding off them entirely for reasons unclear, but likely due to the backlash. However, since then, a bunch of patches have released aiming to fix them, along with adding the Hello Guest thing I mentioned earlier. So what we have today are the versions I'll be judging. First, starting with Back to School, we have to explore this school inhabited by a janitor and his dogs, where we're tasked to complete various different puzzles like acquiring keys, powering generators, or getting spray cans to change the color of spotlights, because that's totally how that works. And overall, this DLC is pretty bad. The puzzles are super confusing and lack direction. I've already beaten the game and still have no idea what the goal was. Like the main game, the AI is annoying here, but also this time there's these dogs that chase us around the school and are also extremely annoying. This larger one just keeps infinitely stunning me, for instance. And overall, this DLC is just a directionless mess that feels more like one of Hello Neighbor's free alphas or betas than a final product. The second DLC, Late Fees, is one of the only games I've ever seen to have a mostly negative reception on Steam without being intentionally review bombed, likely due to, again, the DLCs releasing unfinished. However, upon playing it today, I was actually surprised that I enjoyed at least the main part of the DLC quite a bit. It's essentially like a spiritual successor to Hello Neighbor Hide and Seek, where we basically have to collect a ton of books and then place them in their corresponding bookshelves to light up their icons here and eventually power a switch. The puzzles are pretty fun here and are rewarding too. They're definitely not too difficult by any means, with the only main issue here being the AI of the librarian being pretty terrible, but this being a huge map with all sorts of platforming and places to move made her at least a bit more manageable than most. Still not acceptable for the supposed AI quality you'd expect, but manageable. The big issue with this DLC though is the ending, because it's really bad. After collecting all the books and flipping this switch, the chandelier on top breaks, leaving us with a key to open the basement, where we can lower this chandelier down further and further along with this weird goo to the bottom, and find one more book that was actually booby-trapped, causing the goop to suddenly rise up, and we have to quickly retrace our steps to the top. As a concept, this sounds like a ton of fun. I love this style of platforming, at least in other games, but in execution, it's a huge mess for one reason. It's completely broken. See, I'm far from an expert on this, but from what I've gathered, the goo seems to slowly rise by small increments every frame of gameplay that passes. However, this means if I'm playing on 120 frames per second, for instance, the goo will rise extremely fast, making it basically unbeatable, while lowering the frame rate to say 60 frames makes it move at half speed and turns it into a cakewalk. It makes the game's difficulty completely dependent on something as random as the user frame rate, so there's no set difficulty and kind of kills all the build up leading to the scene. Also, once I made it to the top, I didn't even have an ending. That was just it for the game. I saw other people's playthroughs and they had it, so maybe it was just a glitch on my part, but if the game is so unfinished it can't even end properly, then they are clearly a few patches too short from calling this one a complete product. As for the free Hello Guest DLC, I can cut the devs a little slack for this being included with the main game, and it seems to be their attempt at apologizing for the lack of the guest and the scrapping of Hello Guest entirely by making a mini extension game that features the guest as the main antagonist, which I can totally respect. But this game is unfortunately also a bit annoying. We basically have to use this fuse to power on various machines and have to drop logs, pick them up and load them into a shredder using a crane, then shred them and let them slide into this cart, which we can ride all the way to this church-esque building that we build to the top using the wood pieces, and upon finally reaching it, we ring this large bell, causing it to drop into the ground, revealing a hidden basement, which is where it ends. Now, in terms of the goods, I actually like the fuse puzzle idea of having to ration out our power to different machines, and crafting our own planks that we can use to build our own paths is pretty creative. I especially love how we can also use them to keep the guest away by placing them on doors. That's something they should have totally carried over into the main game. The environment is also super pretty. It's dark and does a good job at creeping the player out. The only problem here is that the gameplay itself, once again, is really confusing at first, and I wish they made more of an effort to explain the use of these wood planks instead of just having to figure it out. Don't get me wrong, I like the mechanic and I think it's done pretty decently, but after hours of this not existing in any of the base game or DLCs, it took a bit for me to understand. Probably the biggest flaw with this game though for me is the guest. The devs went way back on this one, giving the guest his classic weeping angel mechanic once more from the prototype. However, in this environment, it unfortunately works really bad, as the guest is either so far away I can never see him, or so close that he locks onto me and kills me, defeating the purpose of the weeping angel, leading to an experience that often ends up being super enraging. So while I really think it's cool that they chose to bring Hello Guest back, this version honestly ends up being somewhat underwhelming. Granted, it's free and optional. So overall, grouping all of them together, Back to School is annoying and confusing, 2 out of 10. Late Fees has a super fun main section, more fun than any sections of the main game, and has the most potential of them all, but the ending feels very unfinished, 6 out of 10. And the Hello Guest edition is certainly the most creative, interesting, and complete of them all, but still leaves things to be desired with the puzzle designs and AI, also 6 out of 10. Plus, there's that weird helicopter thing, cumulatively combining for a mid to high 4 out of 10. Hello Neighbor Search and Rescue is the Neighbor franchise's delve into VR, made by Steelwool Studios, where the cast of Secret Neighbor are investigating the neighbor's home to save the bagger, also known as Delroy, who was caught by the neighbor in their underground tunnels they were building, and like any other game, our objective is to go into the house and access the basement. Needing 3 separate keys and using a walkie-talkie, we can switch through all 5 of the different children with various different abilities, like bats or slingshots, to complete the puzzles and collect all 3 keys, with some notable examples being starting a car by turning gears and collecting gas, taking a family photo of some mannequins and then replicating the accessories seen in the photo to real life, or shooting a bunch of targets hidden around a room in a short amount of time, just to name a few, while also parkouring all around the place. After finally getting into the basement, we end up getting locked in with a furnace blocking our path, where afterward the rest of the children have to find wheels around the map and turn them, which causes them to pass out into a quick dream sequence with little bits of lore, a lot of which is redundant, like the car crash and the death of the neighbor's daughter, but still in VR are portrayed beautifully. And after doing this with all of them, the path in the furnace unlocks and we find all of the children locked up, where then we play the rest of the basement area as the neighbor's son Aaron, who for lore reasons I'm not sure of, ends up working with the guest who's also down here, and from here we can swap between the 2 characters who play from different perspectives, Aaron playing normally and the guest playing inverted, to solve puzzles and unlock all of the children one by one, which when doing so allows us to find the neighbor sleeping in his basement, where for an interesting change of pace, chase him down as the guest, and after finally catching up to him as he surrenders, we teleport back into the basement as Aaron, where the guest comes back one more time and gives us the red key to unlock the door in front of us, revealing behind it the player of the first game, Nicky Roth, coming full circle as the ones who unlocked us at the start of Act 2 in the first game, which is where Search and Rescue comes to an end. Now, first, in terms of the core gameplay, I never thought I'd say this about a neighbor game, but I'd say, at least for the house part, it's basically perfect. The puzzles this time around are the perfect difficulty. The game manages to use the same neighbor style as all the others, run from the neighbor and try to unlock his basement, but using the different children and having to transfer things around the map works beautifully. It shakes things up in a really good way. I rarely found the puzzles to be too easy, and anytime I ended up getting stuck, it was because of something that was my fault, like missing codes written on the wall, and not something due to bad game design. Along with the puzzles, there's also a big focus on parkour here, which you would think would be a huge red flag. A neighbor game being solely focused on parkour in virtual reality, mind you. That's a recipe for disaster, but it's actually done almost perfectly. The parkour is a ton of fun and really creative. I also love the environments these puzzles are put in, like having us hang off of the wind turbine at the top of the house. It's genuinely wonderful to see the game from this perspective. I even found myself having a good time just messing around with the tutorial introducing us to all the characters. Even the neighbor is done super well here. He's never too obnoxious, and if you need him to go away from a certain area, you can always just switch to a different child and make some noise. So I even really like the neighbor here. Outside of the house, the gameplay does start to drag pretty severely towards the end, as it feels like the basement section goes on and on and on, and the part where we switch between the guest and Aaron is more of a novelty than an actual good gameplay feature. It's honestly pretty annoying to play with at times and confusing, but outside of that, I was ready to say that this game was close to being perfect, like an 8 or 9 out of 10. It's that good and that much fun to me. However, there is one thing I have left out of this review, being the glitches. While the core gameplay is easily Hello Neighbor at its absolute peak, it struggles very badly with bugs. I've heard this game has really bad issues with soft locking and getting permanently stuck, which fortunately is something I've never experienced. For me, the main issues I had with the gameplay come down to two things. For one, the clipping, as while the intentions of the game are generally really good, often if I try to climb somewhere or land awkwardly somewhere, I would randomly clip straight into the walls, which caused me to get stuck for a while, or worse, get completely launched out of the map, which is super nauseating, and makes the game way harder to play in longer sessions, which, side note, while I'm not blaming the game inherently for this title made me extremely motion sick. More than anything else I've ever played, I basically had to just play as much as I could until I couldn't take it anymore, then lay down for a couple hours. I'll exclude most of this in my review as my own personal issues, although these glitches definitely enhance it. Plus, there's just a lot of general lack of polish in this game, bringing me to what might be the most frustrating glitch/issue of them all, at least in my playthrough, the loading screens. These glitches I mentioned earlier wouldn't be all that bad if it meant just clicking a respawn button and going from there. It would only take a few seconds away. However, this game takes absolutely forever to load, at least on a Meta Quest 3 that I played this on. Genuinely, every single time a save is reloaded, it takes like a minute. So anytime I'm midway through a puzzle or midway through parkouring and something chooses to glitch out, I'm forced to sit there waiting for the game to load just to restart and fix an issue that wasn't my fault in the first place, obviously making it so much more angering. Plus, by the way, the loading isn't just annoying because you have to wait a minute or so in purgatory while it loads the game up. It also soft locks a lot, forcing you to close the entire game and reload the entire game, which takes even longer. Or just as bad, a lot of the time it won't load correctly and the player will spawn inside of a wall, forcing another restart. It's ridiculous. The best, or should I say worst, example of this is the ending of the house portion of the game. After finally turning off the furnace in the basement after hours of gameplay and being ready to finally finish up and seeing what this game's ending has to offer, we have to walk into this hallway, causing a loading screen that, for whatever reason, nearly every single time will spawn me either inside of an object or completely outside of the map, forcing me to respawn. I then have to wait another minute, walk back into the loading area, wait another few seconds, spawn out of the map again, and rinse and repeat this half a dozen times. And do you want to know what happens when you finally load in without it glitching out? Another loading screen. And this one is just as bad about launching me off the map, forcing me to restart all the way back to the first loading screen again. Seemingly the hardest part about this game isn't even the puzzles, it's the section right here having to survive 2 successful loading screens in a row without falling off the map. It's genuinely horrific. I don't know how Steel Wool or anybody would see this and think it's okay to release. I know making a VR game, especially one like this, is probably extremely difficult, and that's most likely why other games like the Help Wanted series, also made by Steel Wool, usually contain mini games and doesn't really try with platforming or movement. But if you are going to do it, it has to at the very least work, and this one just doesn't. By the way, would you believe me if I told you that this is the updated version of the game? Apparently, there are tons of reports that the original version at launch is even worse with bugs and even more unplayable. I cannot believe that a game that at its core is easily the best Hello Neighbor game of them all could fall so short because of how buggy it is. And so for ranking this game, it's really hard to do because I can't recommend dropping $30 on this until the issues are fixed. If anyone at Steel Wool is watching this game is clearly not done and needs more care. If these issues were resolved, it would genuinely be the best VR game I've ever personally played and the best neighbor game we've gotten yet. But as it stands right now, I can't really give it better than a high 6 or low 7 out of 10. No game-breaking glitches, it's at least an 8 or a 9. Hello Engineer is probably one of the weirdest spin-offs yet. Originally released on the Google Stadia in 2021, if any of you guys remember that, and re-released on Steam a couple years later. This time, instead of having a neighbor game involving really anything relating to the universe they've built through all this time, instead, we literally have a car building game, where essentially all the children from Secret Neighbor need to build a car for their fair, however they need more parts, and choose to search in the Golden Apple theme park guarded by the neighbor. And from there, we have to go through 3 various acts building vehicles to move throughout the place and collect everything we need, with there usually being various puzzles along the way, like figuring out how to pick up TNT, or building a car small enough to crawl under barricades, as well as able to drive over them. Now, going into this, I'm not gonna lie, I was extremely pessimistic. I absolutely hate this style of game that has plagued multiple of my favorite childhood franchises. Clearly, I'm not the target audience for this genre because I almost never enjoy it, and after going through Hello Engineer, it's probably one of the worst games I've ever played. So first off, with the gameplay itself, it is so confusing that it's not even funny. There are multiple tutorial levels dedicated to showing the player how the cars work, which on their own are fine, but the moment I reached a level where my hand wasn't held along the way, I realized I had no idea how the game was actually meant to work. There's different engines, different structural types, different wheels, different speeds, and different keybinds, all of which are things the player has to figure out pretty much on their own, which was immediately extremely overwhelming and requires immense trial and error to figure out. But even worse is once finally creating a kart, there's the actual level portion having to make it to the finish line and over the obstacles. And this is where the game shows off some of the worst physics I have ever seen. They do a terrible job at rewarding the player for doing the right thing, as the game's physics will constantly force me to get stuck, and I mean constantly. Expect nearly every single level to torment you with this over and over and over again. And when I'm not constantly getting stuck or flipped over, I'm getting launched into the air flying around like an idiot. The third act of the game is focused solely on rocket-powered engines, which are literally impossible to control. I ended up having to watch tutorials on how to beat the game for most of the levels in order to know what cars to build, because I can never tell if I built the car wrong or if it was just the game's fault because of the super unpredictable physics and levels. Even worse, they also tried to add boss battles into the game, which are just absolutely atrocious. The first one just involves placing TNT on the corners of the arena while the neighbor throws dynamite at us, which is a fine concept. It's just far too easy, since if we die, we can literally just restart with the same car and continue moving without the boss regaining any other health. There's really no incentive to dodge any of the dynamite. Or for the final boss fight, we encounter the neighbor's robotic spider machine, and the entire duration of this battle is literally just attach a rocket launcher to the front of the car and hit the bottom of the spider like 5 times with infinite retries, and the game ends with one of the easiest levels of the entire entire thing. And speaking of which, a lot of the later levels in general are balanced super poorly and are significantly easier than the earlier ones. The second to last level, for instance, literally just involves driving around and not getting hit by these spider legs, with no new puzzles, taking no more than a couple minutes, while earlier levels in the game take at least an hour to do without any help. It honestly, to me, feels like they had a very limited time or budget to create this game, so the later levels end up with this super uncreative and easy feel that probably also explains why the final act has only 5 levels compared to the 12 in the first. Not to mention that with the game being designed on Stadia, a console, and ported over to PC later, they clearly didn't know what to do for controls because, like mentioned, we get to wire the keybinds ourselves to the WASD and the arrow keys. However, these controls are unintuitive and some keyboards don't even have arrow keys, making it basically unplayable without a controller. And no, you can't rebind the arrow keys. I don't know why. So overall, the controls suck, the physics suck, the gameplay and the puzzles suck, the boss fights suck, and the only real redeeming qualities I can find in this game are that the environments and music aren't bad, and I thought for as confusing as building the cars can be, when I got a grasp for how to build them, I could see how this concept could work if the devs were creative, but these puzzles by all means are not, and by the time I figured this out, the game was already over. So to me, this game is by far the worst game in the entire franchise, and it's probably a mid to high 1. Hello Neighbor Nicky's Diaries is a mobile game released in December of 2023 with a rich history of betas and other iterations over the previous years, sometimes just known as Hello Neighbor Diaries, and originally designed as a DLC to Hello Neighbor Mobile before being separated into its own game. In this title, we essentially go through 20 different levels, solving puzzles and finding artifacts, playing as Nicky, the main character from the first game, taking photos of objects and then learning about the growth of Nicky and the neighbor's son, Aaron, before the events of Hello Neighbor. Now, to give the developers credit here, I actually really like this concept for a Neighbor mobile game. The level-based system makes the game super easy to pick up and play on the go. It takes the formula of popular mobile games like Angry Birds or Cut the Rope, but instead of washing the game down to some cheap minigame no one actually wants to play, it's a real fleshed out Hello Neighbor game with puzzles, neighbor chases, and all. A lot of the puzzles, at least in the earlier levels, are well designed for the platform, usually involving turning off security systems and finding keys. Simple and mostly effective. Now, with this being said, while I actually think this game, for its first 15 levels or so, is about as good as I think Hello Neighbor on mobile could have been, the last few levels end up going on a huge downward spiral. See, obviously, as the puzzles expand further, the limits for what can be done on mobile while still being fun are reached really quickly, as exploring the neighbor's house for keys or random items starts to get tedious with the mobile controls. That's one of the problems with making a game like this. These controls are inherently not that good and start to get annoying fast, especially in a game where at any moment the neighbor could spot you and you have to run away. Plus, speaking of which, the more time spent in the houses is more time spent dealing with the neighbor, who quickly goes from a fun obstacle at the start to a complete nuisance by the end, as he always seems to be right around the corner from the places the player needs to go, which is super annoying. He truly is just like 90% of the other neighbors in other games and leaves me wanting to throw my phone across the room when he locks onto me every 2 seconds. To solve this, they added collectible gears that can be used to buy power-ups, namely these binoculars to show item locations and the neighbor spots, which help with these problems a ton and are super welcome. But what these power-ups can't fix is that if I do end up getting caught by the neighbor, I am forced to go back, not just to my house, but the very start of the level with everything reset. And this gets the most annoying towards the end, when the levels start to become like 30 minutes long, and all of that progress can immediately be lost by getting caught. Especially in the last level, where we have to go through this weird set of rooms, dodging shadow neighbors. It's something they do after every few levels, but with with this one being by far the longest level in the game and the most difficult, it ended up taking me hours to beat, since every time I'd make it to a new area, I'd of course die and have to restart everything over and over again just to try one more time. Another issue with the game is the lighting. In other people's playthroughs, the house was usually lit up, but in my playthrough, for whatever reason, towards the end, it took place at night, making exploring the houses extremely confusing. I also kept getting consumed by the void in these levels too, and I have no idea why. Also, did I mention the neighbor could teleport? Because he can, and I don't mean spawn in his own elevators, which he can also do for whatever reason. Sometimes he will literally just teleport out of thin air and go somewhere else. This also can include teleporting right next to me while I'm hiding and catching me for no reason. It's honestly hilarious, but I still don't know why it happens. Not to mention, I ended up missing a lot of the cutscenes after the levels that were vital for the story, because when I beat them, my game would just crash. So, I mean, overall, a good chunk of this game is actually pretty high quality, but it's so hit or miss. If you're already a Neighbor fan, you'll probably get a decent amount out of this, but otherwise, the game is just a slightly more arcadey, portable spin on the Neighbor experience you're likely already familiar with, flaws included. High 5 to low 6 out of 10. At the end of 2024 and start of 2025, the devs announced in a few devlogs released on their channel that they are starting a new development cycle for a third Hello Neighbor game and abandoned working further on Hello Neighbor 2, which apparently was supposed to have more content added, notably patch 10. But announced here they would be replacing it with our very first prototype of Hello Neighbor 3, originally designed to be a multiplayer game, Ravenbrooks Online, which actually had an online play test, but that's been gone for a while now, so obviously I can't play and rate it. But afterward, they chose to develop it into the prototype we have here, which they admitted was planned to be an internal build that would never release, but they chose to drop it as a limited playtest to diehard fans to watch the development cycle from the beginning. And when playing the game, as you'd expect, it's extremely bare bones. All we are told is that we get lost in this mysterious town with a population of newly 3 people and needed to somehow get cell service throughout these woods to call a taxi and escape before a storm wiped through town, while also avoiding the darkness. And as we explore this small town, things are off. We find various different abstract people lurking about, and if we venture too far into the dark, a skinny ghast-like creature with a cone on their head would hunt us down, while the other residents will sometimes pounce and make us drop our items. So to beat the game, first we have to grab a crowbar or an other destructive item and a screwdriver around the map, then come across this woman carrying a box with a statue. Simply break the statue and a lightning rod will drop from it. Then after venturing through the woods on a trail, we are brought to a Ferris wheel. Shove the lightning rod into its power supply, then hurry down to this generator that a vandal is destroying and fix it ourselves using a screwdriver. Then back up at the Ferris wheel, simply wait until 3 a.m., where lightning from the storm will strike and the ride will rise, allowing us to get service and leave. However, while that's the main way to beat the game, there's actually 3 other different ones. One where we could just wait for the storm and lose, another where we venture into the darkness and the cone-headed guy gets us, or finally, if we use a crowbar or other destructive items on a generator, it explodes on us and we lose. So first, regarding the gameplay, we probably have the least finished version of any Neighbor game, even less than the Hello Guest prototype. It can barely function, but it's also clearly the earliest version of a Neighbor game we've ever gotten. Most of the buildings and objectives around the map are useless, and overall, the game is nearly impossible to beat without a guide, because they haven't really developed any clues or path or anything. This being said though, while obviously the game isn't really going to be all that good, nor do I think they really care about that at this stage of development, that isn't to say that there's not a decent amount to love here, or at least to get interested in. The core gameplay mechanics and environment, which are probably the only 2 things we can somewhat expect to be consistent throughout development, are actually pretty promising here. The game is open world, but only as open as there is light, light, and any time spent away from lights risks getting caught and having to start over, which doesn't really do much at this point in development, but is still an interesting concept. Plus, it seems like they're planning on having a day-night cycle that actually determines what we can and can't do, like how the Ferris wheel only activated at 3 a.m. It would be super cool if there are eventually environments or stores that are only open and active at certain times, giving us different tasks depending on the time of day, and adding a new dimension of gameplay being time, especially since a big focus in this prototype is not running out of time and having the storm hit us. The other promising thing is the art style and design. They revealed concept art of what the neighbor was going to look like in this style, and also the guest is supposed to be here, which looks super unique and definitely holds a lot of potential. Regarding the new characters, before I had played the prototype, I had seen images of this game floating about, and at first I thought the devs had completely lost the plot. I mean, look at these designs. But after playing the game, this almost like fever dream style is super odd and uncanny. It adds to the idea that we are intruding into a town that doesn't really want us there, and that we are the ones out of place. It's funny enough, the exact same thing that made the original Hello Neighbor games so interesting. So it's a super good full circle moment. Now, in terms of rating what we have here, I mean, obviously outside of the art style and potential of this game, this is hardly even something I can call a game, hence why it's a prototype, leading me to rate the game a high 2 out of 10 if I had to, although again, this isn't indicative of the final product. But they've also released one more prototype just a few days ago, so let's check that out. Finally, we have made it to the last Neighbor version for this video, the second prototype to Hello Neighbor 3. Released a few months after the first prototype, and this one has a similar premise. We are once again stranded inside of this town and have to get signal in order to call a bus over before a storm consumes us all. However, there are a bunch of changes to the gameplay loop and the map that make things much more interesting this time around. In order to complete the game, after spawning, we have to go into the town and into this home where we can find this weird head thing here, and at the top can collect a lightning rod here. Going outside, place the head right here on the statue, and then travel up a trail that leads to the Ferris wheel and find the generator to place the lightning rod. Back at the town, entering this house, at the top we can find the phone to actually call the bus. Then we simply have to defend the statue from vandals and wait for the Ferris wheel until 5 a.m. where once again lightning strikes and powers it on, and we can ride it to the top to call the bus. However, this time we also have to travel all the way back to the spawn where the bus will be waiting for us to escape, which is where the game ends. Along with this option, there's also another way to call the bus, where if we find the forest protector's house hiding in the town here, we can actually use their phone and call the bus that way. Alongside that, there's also other minor endings, like once again the darkness mechanic has returned here, and spending too much time away from light gets us caught by the forest dweller. If we simply choose to walk out of the city, we escape but die by the storm, or of course we can simply wait for the storm to take us itself. Plus, this isn't it for the game and its missions, because once again throughout the town there are these various abstract characters whose actual names are Iris, Jacob, and the Vandal that have friendship meters on top of them that determine how they react to the player, whether they attack them, don't acknowledge them, or are friendly with them, and we can improve this by giving them gifts, or alternatively can hurt them to turn them into enemies. They generally don't add too much to the game yet, but it's clear they'll be a big focus later in development, and they can be fun to interact with or mess with just to see how they react. Although on the topic of them, as a bonus, after calling the bus, we can pull the storm alarm at the top of this house, and in the right conditions can gather them onto the bus to save them from the storm. So in terms of the game's quality, it's noticeably far further along than the first prototype build, even if it's still super primitive. There are new mechanics, as I just mentioned, the town is much bigger and more expansive, and the environments have been improved, showing a better vision into what the devs want the final game to look like. But with this being said, ranking it as a game, it's still very much a prototype, and the actual gameplay itself is extremely confusing, especially since it's clear a big focus of Hello Neighbor 3 in general is to have a more developed developed world where there's no one linear way to play and are instead multiple paths intertwined into this one city, which I'm hopeful will pan out into a good final game, but like the prototype, it's very underdeveloped and just ends up being extremely confusing. It's also pretty annoying to play, especially with the time mechanic, which at least at this current stage serves more to delay the game than anything else, because after completing all of the puzzles, the player again just kind of has to wait until 5 in the morning to actually do anything. So that's another critique, and rating this as a game, it's no more than a high 3 to low 4 out of 10. But once again, we aren't even in the pre-alpha stage, so I by no means take this as a big red flag or anything. I'm not expecting this to be a complete product or anything near it. As a matter of fact, it's progressed quite a bit in the few months between prototypes, I'd say for the better. My only main worry being that, as you've probably seen throughout this video, a lot of the early versions of Hello Neighbor games have potential, and the devs' biggest struggle has always been realizing that potential, which I imagine will be even harder this time around in a true open world setting. But at the very least, I'm leaving this version looking forward to what comes next. So that completes every single Hello Neighbor game released as of today. Here's all of them listed on screen. And overall, while I wouldn't say a lot of the games are really all that good, most of them stand around the middle to lower middle tier for me, I still shockingly ended up having a really good time making this video, and I'm actually going to be looking forward to future Hello Neighbor versions, with Hello Neighbor 3 seeming to be turning over a new leaf for the devs. And after years of being written off as the game that could never deliver, or the game that should have ended years ago, there were still plenty of highlights in the collection, and I'm hoping the developers can hone in on those for a better and higher quality future. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, or at least learned something from it, and have a wonderful rest of your day.